I'm wondering how you see speech on the left and on the right in media, behind closed doors, differing between the left and the right surrounding Israel and Palestine in particular.
Well, Doom was a book inspired not just by the COVID pandemic, but by an earlier preoccupation I had with disasters. And the insight that I was groping my way towards in 2019 was that we didn't have a general theory of disasters. We tended to distinguish between natural and man-made disasters. We would write books about one set of disasters, say wars, but completely different books about pandemics. And I was craving a general theory of disaster. That was the motivation for writing that book. At the end of the book, I come to the conclusion that the distinction between natural and man-made disasters is an artificial one. In just the same way that famines are not really natural disasters, so all disasters, including pandemics, have a man-made character. It's our decisions that determine how many people die prematurely, whether it's an earthquake or a war. This is the key insight of the book. At the end of the book, I say, look, there's no obvious sequencing here. Sometimes you have the war and then you get the pandemic. That was what happened in 1918-19, the great influenza pandemic, which is the last really big pandemic before COVID, came at the end of World War I. Here it seems like the sequencing is different. So I suggested that towards the end of Doom that we might have a pandemic and then conflict. The conflict duly came along, first in Ukraine and then, of course, in the Middle East. And I don't think we're done. I think we're in a period where conflict seems likely to escalate after a time when actually the amount of war in the world was quite low. I mean, we forget this, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, the wars of the 1990s and the 2000s, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, were small wars with relatively small death tolls. We're now back into quite big wars with really lots of deaths. Shocking just how many people have already died in the war in Ukraine. And I think the way in which Democrats and Republicans think about these things is in some ways the same and in some ways fundamentally different. It's the same in the sense that both Democrats and Republicans like to use a language that implies we're staying out of this. The forever war term appeals to people on both the right and the left. Nobody in American politics today says, we need to intervene directly in Ukraine. We need boots on the ground in the Middle East. Nobody says that. And I think that's still the kind of hangover of Iraq and Afghanistan. But there's a difference. And the difference is very obvious, more obvious, I think, in the case of Israel than it is in the case of Ukraine. Ukraine briefly was a fashionable progressive cause. You may remember that there were certain households in California that went from Black Lives Matter to Ukrainian flags in the space of a weekend. And it was an interesting feature of the politics of 2022 that so many progressives decided that the current thing was support for Ukraine. That didn't last long. These things seldom do. But after October 7th, 2023, something amazing happened. And that was that progressive left-wing America decided that somehow the victims were the Palestinians. I look back on those days immediately after the attacks in which so many hideous atrocities were committed against Jewish men, women, and children. And I ask, how could they flip so quickly into a narrative about Palestinian victims and Israeli genocide? This seemed to me grotesque. But it happened on campuses, including the campus where we're having this conversation at Stanford, at Columbia, at Harvard, that young progressives, Democrats without exception, strongly aligned themselves with the Palestinians, even as the Israeli Defense Forces were trying to go after the perpetrators of the atrocities of October the 7th. The left lined up with the people who were the perpetrators, or at least harbored the perpetrators. That was certainly not going on in conservative circles, where there is still, I think, an instinctive feeling that we should have Israel's back when Israel is under attack by terrorists who are backed by the Islamic Republic of Iran.